At dawn on June 19, 1944, somewhere over the vast blue emptiness of the Philippine Sea, a young Japanese pilot tightened his harness and silently recited a prayer. He had trained for years for this moment, this chance to defend the empire. This chance to strike back against the American fleet pushing ever closer to Japan's final defensive lines. Ahead of him shimmered a sky he believed he understood, but within a few hours, he would be falling through it, flames licking the wings of his shattered aircraft, wondering how everything he had been taught could have been so catastrophically wrong. Because on that day, Japan launched the largest massed carrier aircraft attack since Pearl Harbor, an all-or-nothing gamble involving hundreds of planes. What they didn't know was that the United States Navy had evolved into something unrecognizable since 1941. Their pilots were better trained. Their carriers were more advanced. Their radar was light years ahead. And their anti-air defenses formed a sky-devouring machine. By sunset, what happened would be remembered by one unforgettable nickname: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had entered its most decisive phase. The United States had been advancing relentlessly across the ocean, island by island, building airfields, launching new fleets, and tightening the noose around the Japanese Empire. But the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were different. If the United States captured these islands, the airfields there could host B-29 superfortresses capable of reaching Tokyo itself. For Japan, this wasn't just a battlefield. It was the last protective wall blocking a direct assault on the Japanese homeland. And the Imperial Japanese Navy knew it. Japan assembled its remaining carriers, pilots, and aircraft into a single force, the first mobile fleet under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. On paper, it was still the most powerful fleet Japan had ever sent into battle. But there was a problem. One the Americans didn't yet fully realize. Japan had lost its veteran pilots in earlier battles Midway, Guadalcanal, the Solomons. Their replacements were barely trained, some with as little as 100 flight hours. The U.S. Navy pilots, by contrast, were seasoned, methodical killers. Many had survived years of combat, and the Navy's training pipeline was producing world-class aviators at a scale no Axis nation could match. Two opposing forces were moving toward each other, one at its peak, the other a shadow of its former self. The stage was set. On the American side stood the largest carrier force ever assembled, Task Force 58. Under Admiral Mark Mitcher, 15 carriers, nearly 900 aircraft, and the full power of American industrial might humming on their decks. But the real secret weapon was something Japan had never been able to match: radar. Aboard every American carrier and cruiser were teams of radar operators scanning hundreds of miles of open ocean. They could see incoming aircraft long before pilots could spot them visually, and they could vector fighters directly onto Japanese formations with pinpoint accuracy. Japan, meanwhile, still relied on visually spotting enemy carriers from scouting planes that frequently never returned. On June 18th, both fleets searched desperately for each other across the Philippine Sea. Japan wanted the first strike, just like Pearl Harbor. If they could hit the carriers before the Americans found them, the invasion of Saipan might be halted. But nature intervened. A thick band of squalls, known as the Philippine Sea Meteorological Wall, shielded the American fleet like a natural cloak. Japanese scouts repeatedly failed to locate the U.S. carriers. The Americans, however, detected the Japanese fleet long before Japan knew they had been found. Radar changed everything. Shortly after 8 a.m., American radar screens lit up with a massive swarm approaching from the west. One operator recalled the moment. It looked like the entire sky was moving. This was Raid 1, the first of 4 major waves. More than 60 Japanese aircraft fighters, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers were heading straight for Task Force 58. The order went out: fighter direction, launch all Hellcats. Within minutes, the sky above the carriers resembled a hornet's nest. Dozens of F-6F Hellcats roared upward, climbing to intercept at ranges of 60, 80, even 100 miles. This was new. This was different. At Midway, American fighters had waited near the carriers, reacting to attacks rather than preventing them. Now, guided by radar controllers and combat information centers, U.S. fighters were placed exactly where the Japanese raids would pass. The result was a massacre. As the Japanese formations approached interception altitude, they expected perhaps a few American fighters. Instead, they flew into a storm. Hellcats dove through their formations like metal thunderbolts, firing at point-blank range, breaking groups apart before they could even think about their targets. Many Japanese pilots had never faced American aircraft before and, They quickly realized everything was different. The Hellcats were faster, tougher, heavily armed, and flown by combat veterans. One Japanese survivor later confessed, "It was as if they knew where we would be before we did." Within minutes, dozens of Japanese aircraft were falling like burning meteors into the sea. Only a handful broke through the fighter screen. And those that tried to attack the carriers were shredded by flak bursts so dense they formed black walls in the sky. The first wave ended with catastrophic losses. American losses. One Hellcat damaged. Not a single ship hit. Around 10 a.m., the second Japanese wave approached a larger group of nearly 120 aircraft. But now the American fighters knew exactly what they were dealing with. Radar operators calmly tracked the formation. Fighter directors positioned squadrons in perfect attack lines. Hellcat pilots were practically salivating. When the Japanese flew into range, the slaughter began. Pilots later described it as hunting, not fighting. One U.S. pilot radioed back, "This is like shooting turkeys on the ground." The nickname stuck, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American pilots lined up behind unwary bombers and shredded them in seconds. Others picked off fighters attempting to dive away. Even stragglers returning from the attack were hunted down hours later. The third wave, launched shortly before noon, was no different. Japan had sent almost everything, and almost nothing survived. By early afternoon, thousands of men aboard the U.S. carriers and battleships were watching the aerial spectacle unfold. Columns of smoke and fire dotted the horizon as doomed aircraft spiraled down. And yet, the carriers remained untouched. This was one of the most astonishing features of the battle. Japan's attacks were almost completely ineffective. Not because their pilots lacked courage, they were extraordinarily brave, but because they were placed into a machine they were never trained for. Their aircraft were outclassed. Their navigation was outdated. Their doctrine was obsolete. Their pilots were inexperienced. And the Americans had radar. It was as if the two sides were fighting entirely different wars. At around 1 p.m., the fourth and final Japanese wave arrived, or what was left of it. Less than 40 aircraft. Most of them half lost, scattered, attempting to locate American ships using fading radio guidance. Even before they reached the fighter screen, fuel shortages forced many to turn back. Those who pressed on faced a full wrath of American fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Not a single American ship was hit. By mid-afternoon, the sky was quiet. The sea was littered with oil slicks, debris, and the last desperate survivors clinging to life vests. The first Mobile fleet had launched more than 400 aircraft. More than 300 had been destroyed. In one day, Japan's naval air power had been effectively erased. But the Americans weren't finished. Late that afternoon, Admiral Mitcher received word. A Japanese carrier task force had finally been located. It was extremely far more than 200 miles away. Launching a strike at that distance meant that many pilots would have to return after dark, facing fuel shortages and landing on carrier decks without lighting. It was unbelievably dangerous, but Mitcher did not hesitate. He knew Japan's carriers were exposed. If he could destroy them now, the war in the Pacific could shift permanently. He gave the order, "Launch everything." At 4:20 p.m., the sky above Task Force 58 darkened with the silhouettes of more than 200 American aircraft I-bombers, torpedo bombers, Hellcats. It was the single largest American carrier strike of the war, and they found their targets. As the American strike force reached the Japanese fleet, they saw a sight that was almost surreal. Carrier decks cluttered with aircraft, fuel hoses running, ammunition carts scattered about, pilots scrambling, chaos everywhere. The Japanese fleet had launched wave after wave all day so quickly that many aircraft had been refueled, but never launched, leaving the decks loaded with aviation gasoline. It was the worst possible moment for a U.S. strike to arrive. American dive bombers peeled off and plunged toward the carriers, Shakakuhio, Zuikaku, and others. Bombs tore through flight decks, igniting fuel lines and detonating ammunition stores. Columns of flame shot hundreds of feet into the sky. Shakaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, took multiple direct hits. Fires raged uncontrollably. Minutes later, a massive internal explosion ripped her apart. She slid beneath the waves. Heyo suffered torpedo hits that turned her into a floating inferno. She too was lost. Other carriers were so badly damaged they played no further role in the war. The first Mobile fleet, the pride of Japan, is dying. As American pilots returned toward their carriers, darkness swallowed the Pacific. Many had little fuel left. Some were already ditching into the ocean. Mitcher faced a terrible choice. Keep the carriers dark, maintaining safety from submarine attack, and following strict naval protocol. Or turn on every light, on every ship in the task force, to guide the pilots home. Even if it meant giving away their positions, breaking all tradition, Mitchell issued one of the most famous orders of the Pacific War: turn on the lights. Instantly, the Black Sea erupted with brilliant spotlights, searchlights, deck lights, signal lamps. Carriers became glowing runways. Battleships lit up like floating cities. Destroyers fired tracer rounds into the sky to mark approach paths. It was a breathtaking, sacrificial act of humanity. Pilots wept when they saw it. Some crashed on landing. Some ditched nearby. Some never made it back. But most survived, guided home by a fleet that had risked everything to bring them safely aboard. When the sun rose on June 20, 1944, the results of the battle were staggering. Japan lost 3 aircraft carriers, over 350 aircraft, most of its remaining veteran pilots. The ability to wage offensive carrier warfare ever again. From this point onward, Japanese carriers were little more than floating decoys without aircraft, without pilots, without hope. The Imperial Navy had not merely been defeated. It had been broken. A Japanese admiral later reflected, "After the Philippine Sea, we had no air force left worth mentioning. It was the death of our naval aviation." Meanwhile, had lost around 30 aircraft, most to night landings, not combat. The imbalance was historic. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not just a battle. It was a turning point in the history of warfare. It demonstrated the overwhelming advantage of radar, the power of pilot training and doctrine, the deadly effectiveness of American carrier aviation, and the devastating consequences of sending unprepared pilots into a modern war. After June 19th, the Pacific War accelerated. With the Marianas secured, American B-29s began direct bombing raids on Japan. The road to Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and ultimately the end of the war, had opened wide. The Japanese Empire would never again control the skies. And yet, behind the statistics and tactics lies something deeply human. Young men, Japanese and American, fought and died in a sky that changed faster than anyone could comprehend. Some soared triumphantly. Others fell in flames. And all of them were caught in a technological revolution that reshaped the world. June 19, 1944. Remains a reminder that a single day can alter the course of history, not through a miracle or a mistake, but through the relentless march of innovation, preparation, and the hard lessons of war. On that day, high above the Philippine Sea, the future of aerial warfare was written in fire, and the empire that once struck Pearl Harbor watched its last hope vanish into the waves. And that concludes our journey into this extraordinary moment in history. If you enjoyed exploring the past with me, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next deep dive. Now it's your turn. What historical event should we uncover next? Share your ideas in the comments below, and your suggestion might be featured in a future video. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep seeking the stories that shaped our world.